Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be continuing our discussion about World War One and what's happening domestically during World War One. We had left off in the previous lecture talking about the Great Migration. And so just as a brief recap, the Great Migration is what happens when the young white men from the North leave their jobs to go fight in World War One. Those jobs are vacated, and they're going to be filled by women and African Americans for the and primarily by African Americans. And so the Great Migration is when essentially the first wave 500,000, but eventually ultimately millions of African Americans are going to be able to escape the devastating effects of sharecropping in the South and the essentially institutional poverty that created, and be able to go to the North to get better paying, skilled jobs. This is going to allow African Americans to accumulate wealth that they can pass down through generations, which, because of slavery and then sharecropping, wasn't possible. Now, a lot of times this event gets played up as being, just this absolutely wonderful thing, and it is. That is part of the story, and it is the biggest part of the story. It is going to be a game changer for African Americans in the United States. It's going to increase not only family wealth within the African American community, but it's going to give us artistic movements like the Harlem Renaissance. It's going to allow African Americans to escape Jim Crow segregation in the South. It's going to allow them to get better education in the North. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows, as is evident by the number of race riots that we're going to see across the United States. And there's going to be a bunch of them. We're going to focus on two because I'm from Southern Illinois, and I think that these two are both two of these race riots are both happen in Illinois. One, just the East St. Louis race riot, happens just 12 minutes from where I live. So we're going to focus on this, but understand that these two race riots are kind of a microcosm of what's happening all across the North. That these race riots, and they're called race riots because they are race riots. So we're going to see, an angry white mob attacking African American, African American communities, destroying homes and whatnot. But pay attention to the root cause here. And I think this is important. Now, you have a society that believes in social Darwinism. So they believe in grouping people by their race, which inevitably leads to racial hierarchies. And science is telling them to do this. So you have white communities that, even if they opposed the Jim Crow South, still have a sense of superiority. And so that's underlying kind of everything. But when we talk about the East St. Louis race riots and the Chicago race riots, what really triggers the violence is going to be economic. It's going to be this fear of African Americans taking jobs and driving down wages. That's going to be exasperated by race and the idea that we should group each other by our race and ethnicity. Like I've said in previous lectures, every time that society says that it's okay to treat people as, monolithic groups, bad things start to happen instead of, treating people as individuals. So, first, we're going to talk about the East St. Louis race riot because that happens in 1917, which is right during the Great Migration, and then the Chicago race riot in 1919, which is right at the end of the first wave of the Great Migration. There's multiple waves. So East St. Louis, East St. Louis today, is a predominantly African American community located right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. And there's stereotypes about East St. Louis that aren't historically accurate. It's not, it was not originally primarily an African American city. It was essentially a thriving working class community in the early 1900s, located on the Mississippi River. There's, thriving businesses there. And, the population was significantly white at the. And so things seem to be going well in East St. Louis. There's all kinds of industry located in East St. Louis. You can still see the remnants of that today. With the buildings are still there. The businesses, most of the businesses are not. But it's a thriving community. And during World War One, the business leaders in the area actually are going to sense an opportunity. They're going to sense an opportunity to be able to drive down workers' wages and to bust strikes by playing up racial tensions within that community. And so the population is mostly white, and there is this increasing tension between the mostly white community and the African American migrants, the African Americans that are coming out of the Deep South looking for these factory jobs. And so these tensions are mostly revolving around labor disputes. It's the white population all across America at the time are demanding higher wages than African Americans are demanding. And so it's one of those weird things that sometimes that's racist. I mean, and in a lot of cases it will be that employers just are going to assume that they can pay African Americans less. It's also a market issue, an economic issue. Most of these African Americans are leaving the South, and the sheer amount of poverty created by sharecropping has led African Americans to be kind of shocked at how much money that they can make in the North, and not realizing in a lot of instances that they could potentially be paid more. And so you have this two different kind of things happening here. You have the businesses that recognize that African Americans will accept less, and they really kind of drive that. They really kind of drive that home, and use African Americans to drive down wages. And so they do that because, one, they can, because African Americans at the time are willing to accept less, and they do it in part too because for racial reasons, right? I mean, social Darwinism says certain group people by race create a hierarchy. The people who happen to be at the top of that hierarchy, which would be white Americans, are most fit. And so that allows them, because they've created that hierarchy, to treat people at the bottom worse, and that justifies lower wages in their minds. I mean, that's quintessential racism. And so there's this growing amount of tension, and the business community is going to absolutely try to to use that tension to their advantage. African American population has doubled in East St. Louis at this point, and so there's African Americans are moving into what had traditionally been white neighborhoods, and businesses were responsible for that. Essentially, they sensed an opportunity, and they knew that African Americans would be willing to accept less money than white workers, and so to save money, these businesses would go down to the South and send representatives down to the South and advertise in African American newspapers in the South about availability of jobs in these northern cities, and East St. Louis is no exception. So they would put out these advertisements that said, move to East St. Louis, we'll get you a job there. because these businesses would rather hire people that are willing to work for less money. And so the businesses in some cases would even pay for these African American workers to move north. They pay for the train ticket to move them north. And so what they were doing was flooding the market with cheap labor. And then they would turn to the white community and say, look, I know you want to raise, but you're making, let's say $7 an hour to work at this factory. I have this African American worker here that's willing to work for $4 an hour. If you want to keep your job, you need to take a pay cut. Otherwise, I'm going to hire this African American worker. And so, if you already have a society that is being told by scientists there's racial superiority is an acceptable thing, and then your employer comes to you and says, look, you're going to have to take a pay cut. Otherwise, I'm going to hire this African American employee. That's bound to stoke tensions. And so, it's not shocking that the tensions in East St. Louis start to rise. Now, some of these businesses are even more nefarious than that. They never had intentions of hiring these African American workers, and so the jobs that are promised a lot of times aren't there, and so you see this population that's flooding in to East St. Louis and other northern cities that have been promised jobs that just aren't there. And so there's more people than jobs. And so now you have, coming out of sharecropping South, you have this young, mostly male African American population that has no money. They were sharecroppers. They're completely broke, and then the job that was promised them is not there. And so then what do you do all day? And then it's all these young men are essentially just there and don't have anything to do all day, and then where are they going to get food? And then all of a sudden it's, well, you turn to the local government, like for help and assistance, in the local churches, and which is going to increase tension as well, because the white community is going to look at that and blame the African American community, which is totally bogus, because we know that wasn't their fault. They came with the best of intentions. They were asked to come to the city and to take these jobs, and thought that they were going to be welcomed. And so you see just all of this tension rising, and you can see that these businesses in East St. Louis are really kind of stirring the pot for their own benefit, kind of whipping up the white community, and really neglecting the African American community. And so we see that the influx of African Americans show up, and there's more than what the businesses can afford to hire. And some of these businesses meant to hire African Americans, and they did, and some of them had no intention of hiring African Americans. They wanted a large population of African Americans in town that would be willing to work for less, so they could go to the white population, which they wanted to hire, and say, you got to take less money, otherwise I'm going to hire African Americans. And so, I mean, you can just see that this starts to become a powder keg. And even rational people that wouldn't have negative thoughts about the African American community start to become more and more radicalized as their jobs are threatened by their employers, not by African Americans but by their employers. And so it's just this like wildly complicated racial, economic kind of confluence of events that is turning East St. Louis into a powder keg. And so what we'll see is white workers at the aluminum ore company are going to go on strike in East St. Louis. And so they feel like they've been pushed around, and they haven't seen raises in a while, and believe that the tool to negotiate with their boss is a strike. And so we've seen that works typically. Well, the aluminum ore company essentially just refuses to negotiate with these white workers and bring in African American workers to replace them as strike busters. Well, I mean, we've been talking about industrialization in previous lectures, and strike busters are anathema. They're frowned upon regardless of their race. But when you combine the fact that the African American population are African Americans and strike busters, this is going to be just the spark that lights the fuse on the powder keg that is East St. Louis. Now, keep in mind, these African American strike busters, they don't want to be strike busters. They're literally in a situation where, in a lot of cases, somebody else, these companies paid for them to move to East St. Louis, or they spent their life savings to get there. They get there, they have no money, no job, and no ability to go back home or to take care of themselves. Even if you don't want to be a strike buster in that situation, if you're hungry enough, you're walking across that picket line. And so, these African Americans aren't asking to be strike busters. They're essentially left with no options. But that's a complex issue, and the average white worker, are they going to really think that deeply about what's happening here? No, they don't care. They're already blaming African Americans for driving down wages, which is misdirected. It should be at the businesses in East St. Louis that they should be frustrated at. And then they see African Americans cross the picket line, and that's just gonna, all of a sudden things are just going to go crazy. Now, we haven't got to the rioting yet, but we're about to. So tensions are high between the two groups. It's becoming clear that this situation is getting dangerous. And it's at this point that a group of African American men are in a car driving around. And cars back then have carburetors. And so every once in a while, a car will backfire. And I don't know if you've ever heard a car backfire before, because it just doesn't really happen anymore. Based on the way cars are designed, but you've probably heard it on TV or in the movies if it's an older movie. A car backfiring sounds like a gunshot. So car backfires, and it sounds like a gunshot, and happens right next to a white man. The white man reports that he was shot at, that it was an attempted robbery. The African Americans drive away; they're not, doing anything other than driving around in a car. But then it gets reported on the radio that a group of African American men are driving around shooting at white people, and which is, again, irresponsible reporting, right? It's the same kind of concept as of yellow journalism within the Spanish War, Spanish American War. It's sensationalism that gets people to tune in, and so the radio say, an armed band of African Americans, driving around or shooting at this white guy, and so the white community that's already fired up for the deflation of wages and the crossing of the picket line now are just incensed. They go crazy. So the incidents reported as gunshots, as attacking the white community, and that's when a white man takes revenge by firing into an African American home. This sets the stage then for the mass rioting. African Americans obviously are upset about this, and they gathered at the site of the shooting and fired shots into a car with white men, killing two. One of them was a cop investigating what was going on. At this point, just it escalates out of control. Groups of whites start to, that's a strom, it should say storm, storm into African American homes and neighborhoods with baseball bats and guns, beating African Americans. And essentially, the African American neighborhoods, some of the stuff they do is absolutely insane. They'll surround homes and demand that the people in the home come out of their home, which clearly, why would you ever do that? That's, and face the mob, no way. So they light these homes on fire, and then you have a choice, burn to death or run out and face the mob. And clearly, they run out and face the mob. The local police essentially sit back and do nothing, which is absolutely awful. And so the African American communities are essentially have to fend for themselves, and they will. And so what we'll see here when we look at the total number of dead, the African American community takes the vast brunt of this, but there will be some African Americans that defend themselves. The rioting ends up lasting for days. African Americans try to flee across the bridge to get to St. Louis to safety. Members of the white population that are rioting here. And keep in mind, we're always talking about groups here, and we're saying white population. It's not the entirety of the white population of East St. Louis. It's a significant portion, but not all. And so the white community that's rioting goes and essentially closes off the bridges, and so you have African American families that try and swim across the Mississippi River to get to safety in St. Louis, or build makeshift floating devices to get across the river, which is incredibly dangerous, which goes to show how dangerous East St. Louis is. And so, the African Americans are fleeing into Missouri. Eventually, the National Guard has to get called in to restore order. And unfortunately, it's too little, too late. We're going to see about 6,000 homes destroyed, 40 African Americans killed, and 8 whites killed. So you can tell the devastation in the African American community is going to be pretty serious. East St. Louis is going to slowly after this. It's never going to fully recover, which is just a kind of a tragic thing, because it was an economically flourishing company. It doesn't die because of these riotings. I'm not meaning to imply that. It's just the Mississippi with technology becomes less important as an industrial area, so we'll see declines in St. Louis too. But it's this tension is going to cause part of the decline of what happens in East St. Louis. We'll see white flight happen, and so members of the white community will start to move further east out of East St. Louis, and things. It's still one of those things that having grown up around this area, that's just not discussed enough. Most people, even living within a 15-mile radius of East St. Louis, the history is just not discussed enough about what happened and kind of what the results were from what happened and why things happened the way they happened. The combination of justification of racial hierarchies based on social Darwinism and businesses manipulating labor and essentially using the two communities to taking advantage of both communities to save money. And it's I mean, it's just a really kind of tragic situation. And so, and it's actually pretty similar to how these other race riots across the country start. And so we'll see a similar kind of thing happen in Chicago. This is going to be a couple of years down the road, towards the end of the first wave of the Great Migration. Chicago is another one of those industrial cities that is, seeing a significant increase in its African American population during the Great Migration. And again, the African American population is moving into Chicago because they're being asked to move into Chicago. There's these jobs that need to be filled for the war effort, and that's a huge boon to the African American population, because they're getting skilled labor jobs and earning enough money to be able to not only pay for their expenses, but save some money to pass down to future generations. And so, they're escaping the lynchings that are happening in the South, and the severe systematic racism of Jim Crow in the South. And so, there's this huge advantage to African Americans to move north, and they do. And we're going to see a similar rise in tensions between the white population and the African American population. It's the same kind of complaint that we're going to see within the white community. They're going to blame African Americans for driving down wages. The white community that has been working in these factories since their inception have slowly over time been demanding higher and higher wages. When African Americans, poor African Americans from the South and sharecropping that have essentially never been able to get a good paying job, come into these northern cities. They're going to be willing to work for less, just like in East St. Louis, and the employers are going to, because of again this belief in social Darwinism, are going to feel justified in paying African Americans less. And the white community is really going to blame African Americans for driving down wages, and again, I would make an argument that that's not justifiable. That what's happening here is, we can pretty much solidly lay the blame on two groups here. It's going to be for driving down wages, not for racism, but for driving down wages. It's going to be the business owners that are clearly manipulating the racial tensions to drive down costs, which wages. So the businesses are kind of manipulating the situation, and in a lot of cases, outright telling the white population, take a pay cut or we'll hire African American workers. And two, social Darwinism and the idea that we should group people by a race and define them by their race anyway, which ultimately, will lead to racial hierarchies and, mistreatment of people just because of their racial or ethnic identification. And so, those two things come into play here, and, it encourages racism, and it encourages a type of economic manipulation that is going to lead to violence. And so, same kind of thing happens. The soldiers are going to be returning home from World War I by 1919, and they're going to want their old jobs back. And so, in Chicago, because this is happening after the war, as the war is dying, fizzling out, soldiers are coming home. It's not just wage deflation that they're, the wage deflation, the driving down of wages that is going to upset the community. These soldiers that are coming back home, they left a job to go do their patriotic duty. Their country asked them to go defend democracy around the world, and they took up that call. And they really kind of expected when they get back that their job is going to be there for them. Well, when they get back, because they were gone for 2 years, those businesses hired other people, and they hired African Americans. And the African Americans aren't going to want to give their jobs up. I mean, this is life-changing opportunity for an entire racial group. Like clearly they're not going to want to give up these jobs and shouldn't give up these jobs. But on the flip side of that, these soldiers that went and did their patriotic duty, it's reasonable that they want their jobs back. The problem is because of the racial tensions, people are going to start to blame this economic conflict on race, and it's going to create just a massive amount of tension. And so these white soldiers are going to be blaming African Americans for not being able to get their old job back, when clearly that's not the African Americans' fault. It's, you can probably lay it at the hands of the businesses. I'm not entirely sure it's entirely the business's fault either. Again, it's one of those things in life. It's just wildly complicated, and there's lots of different reasons for what's happening. But it definitely is going to express itself in an absolutely awful and terrible way, because what's going to end up happening is, heartbreakingly tragic. What tensions will explode on the shores of Lake Michigan. And so the beach on Lake Michigan is essentially segregated. There's a white half and a black half to the beach of Lake Michigan. And if you've ever been to Lake Michigan, it is a lake, but it looks like an ocean. I mean, it has waves and currents and is just seriously gigantic. And if you've ever been in Lake Michigan or in the ocean, you set your little blanket up on the beach and you head straight out into the water from the place you laid your blanket, so you know how to find your blanket, right? And you get out there, and if you're out there long enough, you slowly start to drift away. And by the time you look up straight towards the beach, and your blanket's not there anymore because you drifted down the beach. Well, that's going to happen to a young African American kid. And so the drift happens. It's not any fault of his own, and he drifts over to the white section of the beach, and the a group of white men, one man in particular, starts yelling at him. The kid, kind of struggling to get back to the black section of the beach, and the white man starts chucking rocks at him and hits him. The young man, a young African American man, will end up drowning, absolutely tragically. Police are called. The African American population doesn't riot here. They do the right thing. They call the police. And when they call the police, there are witnesses there to testify about what happened. The police are not going to arrest the man who threw the rock. And when this happens, clearly it is going to justifiably infuriate the African American population. And so this event will end up sparking a week of rioting. And when it infuriates the African American community, there's going to be protests about what's happening, but it's going to be the white population that is really going to start to terrorize the South Side and the stockyards in Chicago, which are primarily African American communities. And so the it's I mean it's absolutely tragic what happens here. 15 whites and 23 African Americans will be killed, hundreds will be injured, and 1,000 homes will be destroyed in the Chicago area. And so, again, this is really pretty typical. That's happening in every major city around the United States, essentially every major city around the United States. We focused on the two in Illinois because that's where I'm located. But it's pretty typical, and we're going to see a very similar kind of situation. It's going to be the results of social Darwinism and the idea that we should group each other by race, and that's our most important characteristic, and certain races are superior to others, and just the scientific justification of racism and economic tensions, and when those two things combine, these terrible tragedies happen. And I really think history in general, the importance of it is to discuss these issues, to understand how complicated they really are, so we can address these issues to keep them from happening. That we really need to recognize where some of these misguided feelings come from and how unjustified they are, and really focus on this idea that grouping people by their race or ethnicity inevitably leads to racial hierarchies, and all throughout history will ultimately lead to these terrible types of things happening. And so these are the East St. Louis and Chicago race riots, and they're, like I said, they're pretty typical of what happens all across the nation. This concludes our lecture for the day. Thank you very much for your time, and we will pick up with domestic policy during World War I in our next lecture.